Welcome to our weekly national news conference. I'm Sandy Close, Director of Ethnic Media Services. Today, we continue a series of briefings on what many experts call a fight to save representative democracy in the United States, from securing access to the ballot box to ensuring that communities can elect leaders to represent them through fair redistricting. In late April, we co-hosted with the Leadership Conference Education Fund a briefing on two federal bills aimed at blocking the surge of voter suppression bills in many states. Today, our experts and advocates will update you on developments at both the national and state level that may mark a turning point in this battle and on what comes next. Our speakers include Elizabeth Hira, Spitzer Fellow and Policy Counsel with the Brennan Center's Democracy Program at New York University, Alex Gulota, National Interim Director of All Voting is Local, who also organizes in Arizona, and Mimi Mirzani, Executive Director of the Texas Civil Rights Project based in Austin. Thank you so much for speaking to us today. We ask you to speak slowly for our interpreters. If you speak too fast, our moderator may interrupt to ask you to slow down. We invite reporters to enter questions in the chat box, and we eagerly ask our speakers as they see questions that they want to respond to on the chat box to do so. We will take questions for each speaker and again at the conclusion of the panel. We'll send a video of today's briefing, expanded bios of each of our speakers, and relevant collateral this afternoon. Now I turn the conference over to today's moderator, veteran and award-winning journalist, and co-coordinator of these briefings, Sunita Sarabji. Sunita.
Thank you so much, Sandy. Let's begin right away. We start off at the national level with Elizabeth Hira, who is going to discuss the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Amendment and challenges to getting both of those measures passed. Elizabeth, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
So the way I'd love to sort of start our conversation for today, I believe I've got about 8 minutes to sort of give you a rundown to answer your question, and then of course to get into the Q&A. So the three things that I want to talk to you about today are specifically focusing on S1, the For the People Act, formerly HR1, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which are—
I'm sorry, Elizabeth, please slow down just
Sure.
a bit. Thank you.
Sure, no problem. So there are two federal bills that are, because it is one that is actually currently in the Senate and will be voted on as soon as next week. So talking about the For the People Act, I wanted to just get started with three things. One is the content of the bill so that everybody knows what's in it. Two is the context of the bill, so particularly talking about the bill as a civil rights bill. And then third, what is the moment that we're in? And that's where we can understand how HR1 interacts with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to fundamentally transform American democracy. So I'm going to start with the content of the For the People Act. It is about 817 pages, which a lot of features that frankly are all needed. When people ask me why the bill is so big, I say it's because there is a lot in American democracy to fix. And so I like to joke that this is actually just Congress doing its job. This is what bills are supposed to look like, frankly, especially when there's so much to be done in this moment. So a couple of quick highlights. First, the bill includes automatic voter registration, which has been in place all over the country in red states and blue states successfully for a very long time. That would bring tens of millions of American voters onto the rolls. Same-day voter registration, which again has been in place safely and securely all across the country, but we know actually would have a wonderful effect for communities of color in particular and young people, which we know are one of the most demographically diverse generations that we've seen. Believe it or not, 10 states in America do not have online voter registration yet. This bill would fix that. And it would also supply 2 weeks of early voting. Many of us are all too familiar with that one day on Tuesday. If you just you get on the subway a little bit late, you're giving up your right to vote for that entire election cycle. And that doesn't make any sense in modern America. So this bill would provide 2 weeks of early voting with hours before and after. So if you were one of the many Americans, again, particularly women, people of color, and lower wage workers who do not have flexibility to stand in line at the polls, often for hours, as we saw, unfortunately, in the last election, early voting would take the pressure off of that one day, which also would benefit election administrators. Very importantly, the bill would restore the vote to Americans who are out of jail or prison and living in their community. And that could affect about 4 million Americans, 1.7 of whom are Black and Latino Americans, because of the mass incarceration phenomenon that we exist in the country, where people of color are deeply overrepresented in carceral control. It will increase penalties for intimidation at the polls. It includes a full-throated endorsement of DC statehood and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, even though those are moving on different tracks. It bans partisan gerrymandering. So while racial gerrymandering is already prohibited, we often see partisan gerrymandering allow politicians to draw their districts to choose their voters rather than letting voters just choose the people who should lead them. This bill would stop partisan gerrymandering and open the process to let in the public. It prohibits discriminatory voter purges, provides grants for election security and election administration so that states can get paper ballots, that voters can know that their votes are cast and counted as cast, and there are trails that we can trust and rely on. And then it fundamentally transforms the campaign finance system in America, which is, funnily enough, one of my favorite parts of the bill, even though I'm a voting rights advocate, because I think we are asking questions about whether people can vote, and the campaign finance reforms make us ask questions like, well, who should we let them vote for, right? This is our America, and we need to make sure that every American is at the table. So, and the last thing that are sort of Easter eggs in the bill, believe it or not, the Supreme Court is the only court in the United States that does not abide by a code of ethics. So if a president is, put on a bench, is elected into office, and a Supreme Court justice has to decide if his election was rightfully won and she was appointed by him, she does not have to recuse herself under the current status quo. This bill would change that to create a judicial code of ethics for the Supreme Court. And finally, it would require that the president and vice president abide by conflict of interest laws and turn over the last 10 years of their tax returns.
Elizabeth, just go slow.
Okay.
I know you're under time constraints, but we're just getting word from the interpreters that are having trouble keeping up with you. Sorry.
No problem. I will try to go more slowly. It means that you all should know I could talk about this for years. So I'm trying to get as much as I can in, and I'll try to just give you the highlights. I will condense sort of the civil rights context piece. I think the bill is doing 3 things that are very contextually important to understand. The first one is it is advancing the work that this country has been doing since 1965 and before with the civil rights movement. So the example I'll give you to illustrate that is John Roberts gutted Shelby County, in Shelby County v. Holder, gutted the Voting Rights Act because he said discrimination is sort of different in America today. It's over. It's not like it was before. And what we see in the bills that have happened since then and the movements that have happened since then is that is very much not the case. Invidious discrimination, often race-based, is very much still alive in American law. And the quick example I'll give you, you've all heard about North Carolina, the law that targeted African Americans with surgical precision. Another example I want to equip you for is with another community. The Native American community was deeply affected when North Dakota was considering a voter ID law. A government official stood up in the legislature and said, your voter ID will require residential addresses. Native Americans will not be able to meet that requirement because the state does not assign them residential addresses. And even knowing that, the state legislature went ahead and established this voter ID requirement. And of course, the effect was to disenfranchise Native American voters. So that's sort of invidious discrimination in all sorts of ways that we can recognize. The second thing I want to point out is that this is not just a racial justice issue. Intersectional equities are also involved. So there are examples of bills that are facially neutral that end up affecting some communities differently than others. Again, coming back to voter ID, we know that about 90% of American women still change their name upon marriage or divorce. And it is harder for us to get documents, even in the modern day, that show that our names, that as they currently are, match the voting ID that's necessary. Similarly, 378,000 transgender Americans who are eligible to vote do not have ID that matches their gender identity. Imagine what it's like to be getting in your car and going, a poll worker is going to look at this and say, does your name seem like to be what I think it should be? Or do you look how I think you should look? And that could take away your right to vote. And the third thing that I want to talk about is the transformative element of this, I think, is the campaign finance reform. It should be a baseline minimum standard. We should not be asking the question in America about whether you should be able to vote, even though you are a person of color. So that's what the says. People have access to the vote, they have it fully and freely. But the next question that the bill asks, and why I really love it, is because it's fundamentally asking a question about what it would look like to have an inclusive American democracy. And it's making infrastructural changes to bring people into the table who have been left aside before. And the way that I like to illustrate why this is important, small dollar public financing will bring in everyday Americans. Why does that matter? The 117th Congress, our current Congress, is the most diverse in American history. The most diverse. It is 77% white. It is 73% male. Fewer than 5% of Congresspeople in the last Congress reported ever having worked a blue-collar job. And when women, of people of color, when working class and middle class Americans can't be at the table, the majority of Congress are millionaires. When you start to look at those statistics, you begin to realize why the policies that matter to everyday Americans, healthcare, education, stopping the planet from being on fire, have not been prioritized by people who have different interests, because the politicians and the people who support them under our current campaign finance system do not reflect the priorities of everyday Americans. So I understand I'm coming close to time, but it's really important for me to emphasize to folks, I worked on this bill when I was in elections counsel in the United States House. I worked on the first iteration of it. And the reason I am a champion for it is because I think there's a narrative that's missing. This is not a voting rights bill stapled to a campaign finance reform bill. This is an opportunity to fundamentally transform our American democracy by changing who gets a seat at the table, by actually recognizing that we have historical inequities that have left aside so many Americans that can be rectified. And it doesn't require a Truth and Reconciliation Commission or a sociological reflection on America. There are practical, common sense things that are achieved in this bill right now. And I'll wrap up with this. The thing that is most important for all of us to understand is this is a moment that is unprecedented in American history, not just because of the insurrection against the United States Capitol, not just because the last election was not only the most secure, but the highest voter turnout we've seen in over 120 years. The reason that this moment is transformative is because Americans are more engaged than ever, and we are closer than we have ever been to being able to get this over the line. This 817-page bill, for a little perspective, you keep hearing about how it may not go forward. It existed only 2 years ago. In that time, it has ramped up through the United States Congress, has passed one chamber of Congress twice, has already had a markup and a hearing in the United States Senate, and it is a top priority of the President of the United States of America, the leadership of both the Senate and the House. He has even tapped the historic Vice President, my old boss, Kamala Harris, the first woman and the person of color to hold this role, who deeply knows why it matters that every American gets to vote. She matters that she's been tapped to do this role. So our job over the next week, while Americans are sort of teeing up to hear this bill in the Senate, is to let our leadership know, the White House, the Senate, the House, that we need them to do whatever they need to do to get this over the line, because this is table stakes for democracy moving forward. The right to vote and the protection of making sure that every American is at the table is just baseline for us to do the rest of the work that needs to be done. So I see I'm at time. I will leave it there, and I'm thrilled to have questions.
Absolutely. I'll start off with a question for you. What types of amendments to the bill do you see needing to happen before it does actually get passed, given some of the even Democratic opposition to the measure?
So I'm actually not sure that it's amendments to the bill. Actually, the bill has obviously gone through a really serious process in the House, and we saw some really interesting questions being raised, like should 16-year-olds be able to vote, right? Should people who are currently incarcerated be able to vote? Those are sorts of the questions that were being raised during the last iteration when the bill was on the House floor. But I think if your question is what is it that could change in order for the bill to get passed, I think I would almost argue that the question of what we could change in order for the bill to get passed is a bit of a distraction, because it assumes that there is something that could change for the bill to get passed. And I think it's more of a question of the politics around it than the content of the bill. As I said, this bill has been in process literally for years, because many of the bills, Mr. Sarbanes likes to talk about how John Lewis wrote the first 300 pages of this bill. Many of the parts of it have been in place all over the country for decades. It's not like this is a new radical set of theories. This is actually really common sense, practical stuff. And so I think what we're seeing play out right now is a focus on political problems and a distraction that changing the content of the bill would change the political reality around it. And what I would really like to emphasize, all of our polling shows that bill has huge bipartisan support. In fact, a majority of Republican voters support what is in this bill, to the point that Jane Mayer leaked in the New Yorker that there was sort of a frantic scramble on the Republican political leadership side because Republican voters support what is in this bill. And I think we can't emphasize that enough, that the people, the bipartisan American population is united behind this bill. So tweaking bits and pieces of the bill aren't actually going to be what changes the bill being able to get over the line. And I can't emphasize enough, this bill has 50 people lined up behind it who are decision makers. And we just have to make sure that we figure out how to get a couple more over the line. But I think it's a distraction to focus on skinning up the best analogy I have is when you renovate your house, you would never say, I'm going to spend millions of dollars on this, but why don't you leave the door off the hinges? Why don't you put it in 2 years later? You would never do that with your house. Why would you do that with our democracy?
Absolutely. So there are a number of questions for you in the chat. We start with Carl Johnson. Carl, could you unmute yourself?
Thank you. It's Carl from Poly by Design, and I'm a huge fan of John Lewis and this bill. One of the things that I find interesting, and I think it just is a huge opportunity for minority voters, is the extremely low turnout in primaries. In some states as low as 8%, and nationally somewhere around 15%. How do we get minority voters, ethnic voters, underserviced communities to vote in the primaries? Because that seems to be like where we could make a huge difference immediately, because of the overall low turnout in the American population vote. Thank you.
Sure, thanks for your question, Carl. I think your question sort of gets at some of the reflective issues that we were talking about. So when you look at a system that's supposed to represent you, and it very clearly does not have anybody who looks like you or seems to have lived experiences like you, I think it's really reasonable for you to feel alienated from that system. And further, when you see the intransigence that we have in Washington of basically, one of my friends was joking the other day about the 2020 election, which old white millionaire do you want to represent you, was what was on the table, right? And as much as that's sort of joking, I think there's a real issue with just saying it is easy to be despairing and it is easy to give up on government if you don't see yourself or your priorities reflected there. So if we can't get a basic set of agreements about whether climate change is real and whether children in America should be hungry, I don't see that we're making a compelling case for Americans to be involved. And I think, Carl, your question about how HR 1 changes that, by changing who was at the table. Cori Bush is the first person I've ever seen say, I was sleeping in my car with my babies. And Katie Porter is the first ever parent, a single mom of young kids, the first ever in the entire history of the United States. Do you know what? There have been 1,994 senators. 58 of them have been women, 5 have been women of color. We are not at the table. And I don't think we can ask people to come vote for us if we're not giving them people to vote for, people who represent their issues. And I'm not saying people of color are not a monolith, the working class people are not a monolith, but I can tell you for sure that I think it's 97.8% of American presidents have been white men. That doesn't reflect everybody. So even if we don't all agree, at a minimum, we should be given some opportunity to participate. So HR 1, like I said, it's giving you, we know that reporting shows that Black Americans and Hispanic Americans, respectively, 11% of them report that the reason they did not vote was because they could not register on election day, compared to 3% of white Americans. So a simple change like that, Carl, to your question, says, hey, you're invited in. And the campaign finance change we were talking about says, hey, you see somebody who looks like you, or like Mondaire Jones knows what public housing was like, so you can be at the table. And suddenly the issues that affect you every day are what is at the forefront, not what Washington is fighting about under the dome in a way that you don't understand. So people respond when they realize their participation has an impact. And HR 1 changes what the paradigm is, so our participation will definitely have an impact.
Carl, that is such a great question. And I wonder if the other speakers might also address this question. Alex and Mimi. Alex, would you like to take it, and then Mimi?
I would just say one of the things I'm going to talk about is how we, sorry, slowly. One of the things that I will talk about is just engaging communities and how to engage communities. And I think that it is the opportunity to have a government that really reflects our values, and convincing people that that's what we're working toward, and that voting is like the last act in a civic engagement process that happens. It starts right now. It starts the day after the last election, and it doesn't end until you vote in the next election. And the more we get people understanding that that kind of civic participation is what we need to actually make the country that we want, is the more likely we'll get there. And so if we're raising those bars, then people are voting in the primaries because they're engaged at that point in time. We're not just coming to them 6 weeks before the general election and saying, do you want to get involved? The people who are investing money are not investing money just at the last minute. We're saying we want investments now in the political process that get people a voice, a seat at the table.
And Mimi?
Thank you. I am also going to really struggle. I'm in Texas now, but I used to live in New York and work for the Brennan Center, and I'm going to really struggle to talk slowly. I too am going to focus some of my remarks on grassroots participation. And the reason for that is because we have a concrete example in Texas right now. We have a fight over how we are going to structure our elections. And in fact, in a state where it's already the hardest to vote in the country by most measures, lawmakers are trying to make it even more difficult. I'm going to talk about that, but I think one really positive thing about what has happened in the last couple of months is we have seen a really diverse cross-section of Texans speaking out against this bill. I mean, you have people like me who have spent my entire career trying to make our democracy fairer and more just and more representative, to Elizabeth's point. But you also have groups that represent people of color, people of all different ethnic backgrounds. You have business leaders, people like American Airlines CEO speaking out. You have faith leaders who are talking to their congregations. You have economists saying this is actually going to hurt our Texas economy in a moment where we can't afford to hurt it anymore after COVID and after the big freeze. You have Republicans, members of the Republican Party, who are saying this just doesn't make sense. And to Elizabeth's point, I don't think this is what Republican voters want. And so honestly, it's been a hard fight. It's still not over, but I think something that has been inspirational about it is seeing this, growing, really diverse and multifaceted opposition to this bill, and with it a recognition that we, the people, have to own the process, that if the process stinks, the results are going to be even worse.
Thank you, Mimi. Elizabeth, we have another question for you from Leslie Layton. Leslie, could you unmute yourself, please?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I just, and I think maybe somebody before me phrased the question a little better, but we have Arizona and West Virginia Democrats opposed, and I don't really understand what the way around that is, because I don't know what the rest of us can be doing. We're in this area represented by a very, very conservative Republican congressman and senator, so I don't know. If we have Democrats against it, where is the hope for this?
I think it's a great question, and a lot of what America is asking. And I think just important to clarify that Mr. Manchin in particular actually supported the bill in the last Congress, and Ms. Sinema in Arizona, I think is who you're talking about. She's actually a co-sponsor of the bill. And some of what they've been talking about is their resistance to some of the procedural hurdles. So particularly, they don't want to blow up the filibuster in the Senate. And that I like to point out to people, just as a sort of inside baseball thing that you guys might appreciate. We keep focusing on 60 votes, and actually 50 senators could make a decision to change what the rules are. If we are able to make a compelling case, Leslie, to your point, that this needs to get over the line. So 2 weeks is an eternity in Washington. And I think what these people who are a little bit intransigent or expressing some trepidation about moving forward are signaling to us is that they need to hear from the American people about whether this is important. And there's some fantastic polling that's coming out of West Virginia that shows that the For the People Act actually has, I think, more support than even the infrastructure bill, right? So I think our opportunity, and I say this to people all the time, I can guarantee you that this bill will fail if we do nothing. And so the opposition of the bill, as we talked about, the opposition to the bill really is not Republican voters or Democratic voters. It is Republican leadership. And they are relying on Americans giving up. They're relying on this narrative that, you know, an op-ed last week sort of settled the question for all of America for all of time, even though we know that in 48 states, people like Mimi, people like Alex are fighting voter suppression bills, unlike what we've seen since the civil rights movement. So there is for them a currency in creating despair and cynicism. And I think that's exactly the thing that we need to keep spreading the word about the bill to stop. Because I think if Mr. Manchin is able to hear from the American people, from West Virginia voters about why this matters, that actually changes minds. I remember I was in the Senate, I slept in my chair the night that John McCain changed the ACA. Miracles are absolutely possible, and they don't even need to be miracles, because guess what? Different than the last time this bill passed the United States House, the entire force of the leadership of American government, unified American government, is behind getting this bill done. So Kamala Harris, Ms. Pelosi, and Leader Schumer are all unified in figuring out what to do. So we need to let them know we support them, but trust and believe that they need to hear from us so they keep pushing to get this over the line. But I think do not give up, because people who, honestly, I say this, like the bad guys want you to give up, because then they definitely win. So we have an obligation over the next couple of weeks to just get this over the line. And I need you to believe that your leaders need to hear from you to sort of keep beating that drum and make it possible.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that very optimistic messaging. There are a few questions for you in the chat, and if you could please answer those questions. We have to move on to our next speaker, Alex Galata, who is the interim director of the All Voting is Local initiative. Alex, welcome.
Good morning or good afternoon. It's morning here still. It's afternoon, maybe other places. I'll try and speak slowly also. I'm going to start out hopeful, because I think hopeful is important. And I think we need to at least reflect where we're at. And that is, democracy is winning. No mistake, there is a serious and ongoing struggle, but democracy is winning. It's not a struggle between Republicans and Democrats in my mind. It's a struggle between people who believe in democracy over authoritarianism. It's people who believe in facts, data, and science over lies and conspiracy theories. It's people who believe in justice and fairness over pure political power and greed, right? That's what the divide is. It is not a partisan divide. It is a divide amongst values amongst people. And if you look at the 2020 election, we had historic turnout during the worst health crisis the world has faced in a century, right? We forget that. Like, it's like in COVID is like the afterthought or the footnote, but it's like, I'm going to talk a little bit about just some data from Arizona, which is, just from Arizona, but like most of the increase in turnout was amongst communities of color proportionately. And those were the communities that were hardest hit by the pandemic. So in Arizona, for example, African-American turnout was up by 11%. Asian American turnout was up by 17%. Native American turnout was up by 8%. Latino turnout up by 5%. In other states, there's similar data, even higher. In Nevada, Native American turnout was up by 25%, right? Like, that's amazing. And if you look at it, like, especially like Native Americans in Arizona, at one point in the COVID crisis, the Navajo Nation, which is the largest single concentration of Native Americans in Arizona, was the single most infected, COVID infected place in the world, right? The most deaths, the most per capita deaths and and infections of COVID. And in spite of that enormous hurdle, we had enormous turnout, right? And so like, we don't want to minimize that. It's like the forces of democracy won in a big way. And truth and justice and democracy are winning, and we should like celebrate that first and foremost. But the people who believe in authoritarianism and lies and the abuse of power are mounting a huge national fight. It's financed by a lot of dark money. We don't know where it comes from, or we know it comes from, Heritage Action, and we don't know where they're getting it from. And it's clearly designed to silence the voices of voters. And it's doing that in two ways. First, it's just making it harder to vote, right? Just every way that we can think of to make it harder to vote, there are efforts to make it harder to vote. Those include barriers to voter registration, such as were just passed in Florida. Purging vote by mail lists. That happened in Arizona. It's happening in Florida. Outlawing or limiting drop boxes happened in Georgia, happened in Florida, being considered in many other states. Restricting early voting in Georgia. All of the things that helped achieve the historic turnout in 2020 are being whittled away. They're being attacked. They're being outlawed in a variety of different states. Not everywhere, not completely, but there's a huge effort to try and make that happen. Second, and even more troubling possibly, is the efforts to try and use raw political power to actually overturn the results, not just to make it harder to vote, but to maybe even not count the results, which are in Georgia taking over boards of elections, and here in Arizona questioning the outcome of the results. This election review that's happening in Arizona is happening after the fact, but what's going to happen the next time there's an election they try and do something like that? And the last thing is just going so far as to actually making threats against election officials. And if you didn't see it, there's a Reuters special report today about threats to election officials in Georgia. And you should read it because it's scary, it's bad. So that is very anti-democratic. And so we're trying to make it harder to vote. We're trying to create systems that try and in ways limit the way that our votes, whether our votes get counted and how they get counted. And that is a big and bad push, and it requires us to be engaged. It's not all bad news. Like Nevada, for example, just passed a comprehensive voting rights bill. You haven't heard much about it because we like to report bad news and not good news. But it's comprehensive, positive, sort of for the people-ish, for Nevada. It includes a provision that every registered active voter will receive a ballot by mail, because we know more people vote if they get their ballots ahead of time. One of the things we talk about in Arizona is that, I know, slow down, sorry. One of the things that we talk about in Arizona is like, many people get their ballot by mail. So Arizona has been voting by mail for 15 or 20 years now, 15 plus. In this last election, 88% of people voted by mail. But a lot of people get their mail-in ballot, go over it with their kids or their family, do whatever research they want to. Ballots are complicated. We have initiatives and referenda and all kinds of other complicated things. There are judges. Voting is not a simple exercise. It requires you to become educated to be able to cast your ballot. And people use the mail-in ballots to do that, and then sometimes go and vote in person, right? And so like having every voter mail the ballot and be able to like take the time to study it and vote it the way that they see fit with the education that they find necessary to be able to make their choices, like that's such a good thing for democracy. And to have like the president of the United States actively undermining that in the last election was a really bad thing for democracy, right? That movement to like have everyone get their ballot and be able to study it and make good choices was a great thing. Not just a good thing, it's a great thing, and we need to keep moving it forward. We're not powerless, right? These bad state bills are not the beginning they're not the end. I mean, they're just the beginning, right? They need to be implemented. And we have to be part of that process. Like all voting is local. The group that I work with, that's what we do, right? Our whole mission is making sure that whatever the laws are that relate to voting are implemented in a way that creates the highest level of access, right? And we use data and we use organizing and we use communications to make that process work for people. Make sure that election officials are not overly restricted, that they exercise their judgment in a way that maximizes the number of voices that are heard rather than minimizes it. And that's a process that's going on right now. For 2022. It's happening right now in almost every state. We're starting to plan for next year, and election officials are starting to plan, and we can impact that process. Second point is continuing to push for the federal legislation. Absolutely critical. It sets like universal minimum standards for voting and requires that jurisdictions that have a long history of discrimination get permission before changing their voting laws. That's the For the People Act and the John Lewis Act. So those two critical pieces of legislation are critical. And then the third thing, which goes back to the first question, is educating our communities and mobilizing them to really understand that like voting is the last act in a civic engagement process that they should be involved in now. Getting the national funders that fund this kind of work to actually see that and to recognize that and to embrace that and to really get folks involved so that we ensure that the 2022 elections are even more successful than the 2020 elections. So without a doubt, we're facing serious threats to our democracy. We need to encourage businesses, community leaders, thoughtful voices on both sides of the aisle to stand up for democracy and truth and justice. And then we can make sure that every voice is heard and we can create a democracy that reflects us all. And I'd love to take some questions. That's all I prepared.
Thank you so much, Alex. I'm going to start off with a question for you. The critics of online voter registration and mail-in ballots say that there's a high probability of fraud. And I wonder how you might address that.
One could say anything, right? So you can say that, okay? But in fact, no data supports that, okay? Like Maricopa County has been doing this for 15 years. There's not a documented instance of like voter fraud because ballots were mailed to people. It's gone from 40% of the people to 88% of the people. It elected our primarily Republican House and Senate. Every person in our legislature was elected primarily with by mail ballots. And so there's nothing wrong with them. They are secure. We have ways to secure them. We use signatures to match them. It's actually a scientific process that works. And the ballots can't be duplicated, counterfeited, and or manipulated in the ways that people say they can. And there's no data that supports that. And the Brennan Center has some number that is so far out on the decimal places I can never remember it, but Elizabeth can probably give us that number, but it's like 0.00 something percent of election fraud based on the number of ballots that are cast.
Absolutely. And
you're more likely to get struck by lightning than to commit voter fraud.
It's interesting. There are a number of questions for you, Alex. We'll take one from Peter White. Peter? All right.
Can you hear me now?
There you go.
Hi. This actually was, to Elizabeth's point, it's really great to hear the enthusiasm from the speakers. I'm one of those people who are just so demoralized by what's going on in Washington, but I'm still worried about, okay, the Republicans vote as a bloc. I mean, how likely is it that some of them will listen to the bipartisan support of voters in their states and break ranks with the leadership? I don't think it's very likely.
Henrietta Burrows also asked that question, and I wonder if all three speakers could address that. Alex?
I'm sorry, I'm still unmuted apparently. I would just say in Arizona, the split Republican Democrat is one vote in both chambers, okay? And knock on wood, we're not adjourned yet, but we're getting very close to the end of more than 50 anti-voting bills that we were tracking and have been tracking. Only 3 of them have passed the Arizona legislature. There were basically the bill that was in Georgia that has, 50 provisions was broken up into 50 different bills in Arizona, and they were running them as separate bills. Only 3 of those bills have passed the legislature, and that's almost always because at least we can get one person to see reason often, even though they usually vote in a block. There's been a lot of business pressure and business support, especially the bills that are clearly based on conspiracy theories or lies. The idea, and there are many of them, and I can go into more detail about what that means if people have questions, but there are just obvious bills that have no basis in data or fact, and we've had people stand up against those and say, I'm not going to support that. And so I don't believe it's just it. They generally move together, and it's a caucus for a reason, and they're pretty powerful, but it's not monolithic, and I think we can actually make a difference. And I see in Arizona this session, even though we thought it would be a bloodbath, that we've in fact made real progress by getting moderate people to say no, because some of this stuff is really bad and they understand the damage it can do to democracy. Having businesses speak out has had a huge impact on being able to get cover for those people in the middle who want to stand up.
Henrietta Burrows asks a follow-up question. Henrietta?
Thanks so much, Sunita. Alex, you said that the divide was not partisan. It fell along the lines of values. And yes, there are more Latinos who voted in Florida and also in Texas, but along the Rio Grande, there was an increase in Latinos voting Republican because they shared those values that were for democracy, less against socialism represented by AOC. And they thought the Republican Party represented the values of respect for home and free enterprise. So it seems that the values part is also along partisan lines. Wouldn't you say?
I would say not completely. Is there a party that seems to be more enamored with lies and conspiracy theories at this point in history? Yes, I think there is. Does that party attract a very mixed of people? Somewhat. But I think a broader coalition of people believe in truth and democracy and freedom and justice and are fighting for a broader set of values. And so I don't think it's monolithic. I'm not Republican or Democrat as regards voting rights advocacy. I'm for access to people to express their voice and to pick people that reflect their values and their issues in their community. And will there always be some voters in various communities that are going to vote this way or that way? Yes. But what we want to see are politicians that actually care about their people and understand their people and vote with their people. So when Elizabeth talked about a single mother in Congress who in fact knows what that means, or someone who was actually homeless, or somebody who tended a bar, I want that to happen more. And I think the more that happens, the more America will reflect the values of all Americans and not just who the rich and powerful people want us to represent.
Alex, thank you so much for your.
Can I make a quick note on the Rio Grande Valley? The Texas Civil Rights Project has an office in South Texas, and I'm quite familiar with the region. I just want to make the point that I actually think that some of the shifts in voting patterns just underscore that most Americans are not actually wrapped up in this like Republican Democrat divide that we often get our heads in a frame that in fact, you know, the Rio Grande Valley is rural. It was ravaged by COVID, ravaged by the economic effects as well. You know, the Latinx community is so far from a monolith. I mean, it's like a fake term to encompass all sorts of people. And so anyway, I just want to, I actually think that that example just underscores that you can't slap kind of simple partisan labels on things and think you know how it's going to resolve.
Thank you, Mimi. It's a nice segue to your turn to speak. So welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Everybody. So first, I just want to thank everybody for inviting me here today, Ethnic Media. I want to make a quick personal note. You might have seen my dog in the background. My poor dog is sick. And so I don't normally have a dog in here if I'm doing the sort of public thing, but he's a little sick. So if you hear him coughing, it's okay. I'm taking him to the vet later. I appreciate you, allowing me to bring my whole self to the media briefing.
Absolutely. Sandy has a dog as well that she often brings to us. Yes. So welcome.
Thank you. So, look, I'm going to make 2 points. I'm going to try to make them succinctly and slowly. One is I wanted to walk through the voting rights fight in Texas and why the nation's eyes have been on Texas in the last couple of weeks. And then I wanted to talk briefly about what federal reform could mean for Texas and forecast a little bit of what I see coming down in the weeks ahead. I recognize that we're getting closer to the hour. So just a note, I'll make sure to drop my contact information if folks want to follow up with me, especially as the legislative fight continues to unfold in days ahead. All right, so what's happening in Texas? Texas is still in the midst of a huge fight over a complex election law bill. The shorthand is SB 7, which only refers to the Senate Bill 7, the bill number given to it in this last legislative session. This bill, which is quite complex and has a variety of provisions, would make voting more difficult for everybody in Texas, but particularly for vulnerable populations. And the ones that are really targeted, as I'll illustrate, people of color, people with disabilities, and people for whom English is a second language. So this has been a multi-month fight. The bright side, there's a couple bright sides to date. One is that thousands of people have made their voices heard. And because of my limited time, I'm not going to go into it, but this has looked like people driving from El Paso to Austin. That's a 16-hour drive to testify in the Capitol. I spoke at a rally in Austin a couple weeks ago, and there were well over 500 people in attendance over voting rights. I honestly have done this work for a long time. I never thought in my life I would see that. We have seen thousands of calls to lawmakers, and our coalition of community groups alone has well over 100 community groups that have been actively engaged and united. That's a lot of people. Ultimately, because of all of this, this pressure and opposition, there was a very dramatic moment a couple of weeks ago at the 11th hour of our legislative session when, driven by our Mexican-American Legislative Caucus and our Black Legislative Caucus, lawmakers walked out, deprived quorum, and therefore killed the bill because it was right at the end of the legislative session. I will say, again, as someone who's done this for a long time, even the most feisty of legislative floor debates are usually not like an action movie. And it was one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen in my career. And again, around voting rights, around this issue of the heart of our democracy. All right, so what's all the fuss? I'm gonna actually drop this into the chat. I have a list of provisions that are in this bill, but because it is quite complex, I thought it might be helpful for me to put it in the chat. In essence, the version of SB 7 that came out of the conference committee would have slashed early voting hours, So doing away with extended hour voting that Alex talked about allows especially working class folks who are shift workers to vote. It would have eliminated Sunday morning voting, which is particularly popular with Black churches as a way to encourage people of faith to vote right after services. It would make it more difficult for voters with disabilities and people for whom English is a second language to get help casting their ballot. I mean, this sort of help is the type of thing that is preserved in the Voting Rights Act. It put new forms on people driving people to the polls, which would have the upshot of probably dramatically chilling, if not eliminating, rides to the polls. A whole host of new crimes around get out the vote activities. These things are vague, they're confusing. And I'll tell you, I mean, the weekend the conference bill came out, my phone was ringing off the hook from community groups like the Texas Organizing Project, community groups like Workers Defense Project. I mean, these are groups that are organizing immigrant populations, working class folks, people of color, groups that mobilize young people on campus, calling me frantically, wondering if they were going to be able to run programs to encourage people to vote. It also prohibited local election officials from distributing vote by mail applications. Think about this one for a second. I mean, that's so strange. It's, local election officials are tasked with administering the election. You have a right to vote by mail if you're over a certain age or person with disability, incarcerated, somebody who's in college, but your local election official is not going to be able to tell you about it or give you an application. It also empowered partisan poll workers who we know in Texas and nationwide, unfortunately have a history of voter intimidation against people of color. And that is not an ancient history. We saw it and we've recorded it in 2020. And then finally, there was a last minute addition that would make it easier for politicians alleging fraud to have elections overturned with very limited proof. If that sounds familiar to anybody, it should. So because of the time constraints, look, almost every single one of these would make access to voting more difficult for people of color, people with disabilities, and or people with limited English. In fact, one of the reasons I feel quite such an exciting day is I testified in front of Congress just a couple hours ago on how many of these provisions would not have passed pre-clearance if the Voting Rights Act still had Texas under federal oversight, and made the cases, sadly, Texas is a prime example of why there must be federal oversight over election law changes, and why that has to happen fast. But one note I'll make, because sometimes this is overlooked, is pre-clearance was important, not just because it would have stopped these provisions after they were passed into law. It also had a deterrent effect because it forced lawmakers to analyze the effect of these provisions. And something that has been, perhaps one of the most disheartening pieces of this is lawmakers have essentially refused to do any serious analysis of how these provisions would affect communities, all communities, but particularly vulnerable communities. And the Texas Civil Rights Project, a civil society group that is fueled by private donations, and we are pretty grassroots here. We did this sort of analysis. We showed that, for instance, people who used after-hour voting in Houston in 2020 were much more likely to be people of color, even though early voters overall were more likely to be white. We published last minute a 25-page report showing the history of voter intimidation against people of color in Texas and how that continues today. We showed how drive-through voting, very popular innovation, that was used by more than 127,000 people in Houston, was also, it was used by people like me, who I'm a white woman, but I have 2 kids under 5, and you better believe me, it's hard to get them out of the car. So people like me use drive-through voting, but we also know for a fact that it was disproportionately used by people of color. Lawmakers not only refused to do this sort of analysis, they wouldn't even acknowledge this homework when we put it into their hands. And the last point I just want to make is that, I've thought about this a lot, and I think one of the reasons that lawmakers have continuously refused to acknowledge the evidence that we're giving them is because these provisions have nothing to do with voters in Texas. And honestly, the bill proponents are hardly pretending that it has anything to do with voters in Texas. I mean, Alex mentioned we now know that Heritage Action has spent millions of dollars, and not just millions of dollars to support this bill, but millions of dollars trying to manufacture grassroots support. So they've, as far as we know, they've paid people to go to the Capitol. We haven't paid anybody. We've had, all these people showing up on their own accord. Amazingly, the whole time we've had lawmakers struggle to answer fairly basic questions about the content of the bill. And now that the dust is settling from May 30th, some of the most incredible claims are that bill sponsors are saying they don't know how new provisions got in the conference report. Brian Hughes, the sponsor of the bill, told the Houston Chronicle that yesterday, and he doesn't know where that provision came, making it easier to overturn elections. I mean, one, it should really concern us if lawmakers don't know how language is getting plopped into a bill. But secondly, Brian Hughes himself suspended regular legislative procedure to railroad this bill through, and it was voted on by him and lots of other people in the middle of the night. And so the best thing you can take from what he just told us is that he didn't read the bill, and he didn't care to, and he knew how he was going to vote from the very beginning. And I do think it's interesting, and again, to a positive point, under the light of day, there's a lot of backpedaling that we're seeing. Same thing with the elimination of Sunday morning voting, that now there's claims that that was a typo. Again, pretty hard to believe you could have a typo, that the law said the bill said it was prohibiting voting before 1 p.m. They said it was a typo. It should have been 11 a.m. Regardless, I know I'm running short on time. Look, this fight is far from over. I do take a lot of hope in this grassroots movement, this broad-based movement we've seen against the bill. I actually think it's very hopeful that lawmakers, when questioned by reporters, that they keep changing their opinion on the bill. The governor said he's going to call a special session, but we don't know, that hasn't been scheduled yet. And for all the reasons Elizabeth said, I mean, I do have, look, this is a moment for federal lawmakers to step up. And I think that they have history on their side. They have moral clarity on their side. They have data and facts on their side. They have public opinion on their side. Yes, it's going to take some courage, but quite frankly, in my biased opinion, you should have some courage if you're trying to represent the people of the United States of America. So I'm holding out some hope that we will get some help from the feds, while at the same time, we're going to continue to fight like hell, quite frankly, to protect our democracy in Texas.
Mimi, are you already seeing legal challenges to the measure?
So it has not been passed yet.
Right. Before it's been passed, I should have.
That's right. I will say I expect many legal challenges if it is passed.
Thank you. Manny Otico has a question that I think all 3 speakers could address. Manny?
Yes, my question is that we see this wave of voter suppression laws. I would think in America that we'd try to get more people to vote to the polls, because one of the big problems is voter apathy. So what is the goal in trying to stop people from voting?
Look, I'll answer this one because I'm fighting the good fight in a place like Texas. You know, honestly, a lot of it, in any complex system, there's a lot of different reasons. I will say one big reason is that I have seen is that there is a move by the people who are currently in power in the state of Texas to insulate their own power by changing the rules of the game. And the fact of the matter is Texas is changing, but Texans have all sorts of points of view. And I don't take it for, look, I don't actually think that Texas's demographic changes inevitably mean one thing or another for one of the political parties or the other. I think what's very worrisome is that the political party that's in charge now seems to believe that they either can't now or can't soon win majority support with their current messages and policies. And the answer to that in a democracy is to change your messages and policies. And instead, we've seen a response of trying to change the rules of the game.
Absolutely. Alex, you had responded to this question in our pre-brief. I wonder if you could share those comments again.
I'm not sure I remember what I said. I just put a note in the chat that it says it's just pure power hoarding. It's that, there are a group of people that have power, and when people have power, they don't let go of it easily. And as Mimi said, they're not winning hearts and minds, and so they want to still win the game. It's a game to them. It's not people's lives. It's not democracy. It's a game, and it's a power hoarding game. And once they have it, they don't want to let go, and they don't want to change their opinions. They don't want to change their policies. They don't want to be reflective of the community we're becoming. They simply want to continue to protect the white, to be quite honest, racist system that we've maintained for many years. And it needs to be diversified. And the people who have money and power are primarily people who are not open to that happening, or not very open to that happening.
Absolutely. Sandy, I'm going to turn it back to you for final remarks.
Well, thank you. I loved this briefing. People spoke with passion and with real experience and practical examples. A last question for each of you, if you could answer it in 30 seconds. Is there a point at which you fear people will lose faith in voting? We have the Brennan Center has documented, what is it? It was 22 states, now it's more states pushing to suppress access to the ballot. And as Elizabeth said, the worst thing is the idea of, and Alex, you said this, where the people running the elections will even be able to discard what the meaning of your vote was, to overrule the voters. Is there a point at which we really could see people lose faith and say, at this point, there's no use, just walk away? You've given us such a great sort of sense of mobilization, of people really caring and sustaining the momentum of the turnout. But at what point could people lose faith? I don't know if Elizabeth is still online.
I'm still here.
Yes.
I have a very simple answer for that. And it has always stayed with me. It was a young woman who was in Standing Rock, we're talking about how this was the first time that she was ever going to vote. And it was just when the voter ID laws were disenfranchising so many people. I think it is reflective of what we're seeing in America, that the effect of these laws are to actually energize people. That is why the last election had the highest voter turnout we have seen in over 120 years. And the largest number of people voted in an election. And the way that this young lady summarized it, that I almost feel like I want to get tattooed on my heart, is I didn't know how important my vote was until I saw how badly they wanted to take it away. And I think that is the lesson to America, is you realize that people who have for too long been in power because of institutional racism, because of patriarchy, because of all of these systems of oppression in America that have always told you you don't get a seat at the table, They are afraid right now that you will recognize your power and that you will use it. And that is why we see Americans coming to the table, because what if this country belonged to everybody? And I just wrote this piece for the Brennan Center that sort of emphasizes equal was written by a slaveholder. It was meant to mean men alone, certainly not meant to include people that we didn't see as people at the time. But that foundational principle has been given animation and breath at Seneca Falls, at Stonewall, in Selma, and that is what we are doing today. And that is why people are out on the streets. If Mimi had told you that the Texas legislature was going to shut down this bill 5 years ago, you would have told her she was lying. And yet, and still, that is what we were seeing, right? We are seeing legislators knock on doors in Georgia to say, I witness what you're doing. And then the people in Georgia flood the streets because they witness too. And they change these laws even before they make it past the state house, right, into the legislature. We're seeing proposals pulled back even while these people are fighting. So I think people are reminded, they're seeing that they are fighting the hardest that they are because it is darkest before the dawn. And like the change that they are against is frankly the animating principle of American democracy, and they can't win.
Thank you. I don't, it's hard to go after that. That's a great answer. But Alex and Mimi, just very quickly, a last word. Alex?
Yes, ditto. It's late in the morning, and
okay.
If we allow people to lose hope, they will lose hope, and so we can. They want us to feel defeated. They're attacking everything in every way to keep us feeling defeated. But we just turned out the best election ever under the most adverse circumstances in a century, and none of us are celebrating that every day. We should be celebrating that every day, and the more we celebrate that every day, the more likely it is they won't win the sort of the hearts and minds in terms of making us feel losing hope. We're not going to lose hope.
Thank you. Last word.
I think everything I've said honestly should make people feel hopeful. One other thing I'll say is, there's a group of us kind of planning a series of community events this summer to continue to educate people about the bill and build opposition to it. And we're looking towards an event in Austin on June 20th. And based on some of the other crowd sizes, I think we will have thousands of people. And to Elizabeth's point, never ever in my career thought I would see thousands of people in the streets in the hot Texas sun to, show up to fight for their democracy. And these are people from all walks of life. And if that doesn't make you hopeful about the future of our democracy, I don't know what would.
Thank you so much. You have given, I think, a lot of us who felt this is sliding backwards. No, we're maybe not seeing the full picture. Thank you so much for expanding our lens. Thank you.